Welcome everybody to the Oldsmar Climate Resiliency Plan workshop. Thank you all for coming today and spending a little bit of your evening helping us develop the best plan that we can going forward. My name is Ashley Painter. I am the Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Oldsmar. We also have tonight Mike Flood, who is the primary consultant for our consultant firm WSP. We'll be going over some of the information tonight as well. So a little bit of housekeeping. You'll notice that you've all been muted tonight. If you have any questions or any comments throughout, please use the chat or the Q&A functions. We also have in the handouts, several handouts, including this presentation for you to go over. Some of them are from past workshops, but also just additional information for you to have going forward. We do want this to be as interactive as we can, so we do want you to utilize the chat and the Q&A functions. We will also be doing a couple of polls as we go forward. Also, just so you know, this is being recorded so that we can capture everything as we move forward in our plan. All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. If at any point that you cannot hear me or you need us to repeat or go over something again, just let us know in the chat and we will make sure we adjust. So our CRP, or the Climate Resiliency Plan, this is just to go over a little bit of where we've been and where we have to go. So we started out in May of 2020, so just under a year ago. We started by identifying the climate hazards that would affect the city of Oldsmar. There are 5 that we determined that would have the biggest impact on the city: temperature and humidity, precipitation and inland flooding, sea level rise, storm surge, and extreme weather events. Once we determined our climate hazards, we then looked at all the different assets in the city and started to create an inventory of everything that we have, from buildings to roads to pipes, underground and above ground. After we had our asset list, we started looking at what the exposure to those assets would be for the climate hazards. Are they in a high risk area? Are they going to see flooding, or are they far enough away? After that, we started with our prioritizing of our vulnerabilities. So we looked at the different assets and how vulnerable they were to different climate related factors, and then started ranking them based on their vulnerabilities. We're into the actions portion now. So we're identifying the actions that we need to take to make sure that Oldsmar stays resilient. And this is where we want your input as we go forward. We want to know what you think, what actions you think we should prioritize, and also what other metrics we should look at when determining the appropriateness of different actions. So as we go forward, we're going to start with understanding what our climate risks are. As we talked about before, heat and humidity is one of a major risk. We are in Florida. It is hot and it is humid. One of the things that going forward is that our heat is only going to get greater. Looking at our graphs here, you could think like that doesn't look like the temperatures are increasing that much. There's just a couple of degrees here and a couple of degrees there, which doesn't seem like a lot. But what we're finding with our studies is that not only is the temperature increasing, but the number of days that is above 90 degrees is increasing. So we're just never cooling down. Additionally, which is kind of interesting, is that while our daytime temperatures may not, or our extreme highs may not be getting that much higher, where we're going to see one of our biggest impacts is that our nighttime temperatures aren't getting as low either. So that means that time of the day where you were able to cool down and kind of reset we're not getting that cool down time. So our hot temperatures just feel hotter, even if they're staying the same, because we're never able to cool down the way we did before. As we move into our flood risks, there are three categories that we identified as different types of flood risks. First is sea level rise. Second is storm surge. And then third is rainfall flooding. So this is just our normal like summer rainfalls. It is not associated with any extreme event. It is just a normal rain flooding that will happen. I'm gonna turn it over to Mike to go through some of the mapping and modeling that we've done for our flooding events.
Great, thank you, Ashley. Good evening, everyone. Yeah, one of the most important things to develop when you're considering kind of the long-term effects of climate change is, what does that mean? Not in the abstract term, but in the the realistic term. What could really be affected by changing climate conditions? So one of the most important elements to determine that is to develop, some physical information, physical modeling information that helps you identify areas that might be impacted. So with that understanding, with that definition, you can take effective action from what's anticipated to occur in the future. So as Ashley identified, we developed understanding of the changing, how tidal effects are going to change, how storm surge is going to change, and how precipitation flooding is going to change into the future. So the first series of slides we have here is the one on the left, is basically kind of the areas that would be anticipated to be flooded by the highest of the tides, and then how that would look again in the future with 4 feet of sea level rise in the bay. And you can see kind of the maximum extent of where you could anticipate tidal flooding to occur. And if you walk through the next series of slides there, Allie, you can kind of see that there's the areas that would be anticipated maybe during the king tide condition, which is the kind of the areas filled in with yellow, and then also areas that would be anticipated, maybe once a year. And it's important kind of define it from that perspective, because often people talk about it as a daily condition, but obviously you would want to take action before you were exposed to tides on a daily basis. So that's one of the important data points that was woven together. From there, we transitioned to this determination of storm surge. And here you can see on the left, basically this is kind of an overlay of both conditions, but the left is the anticipation for storm surge based on your current analysis that FEMA is identified for the city, and then the one on the right is what that looks like with additional 4 feet of water in the bay. So what would kind of a moderate chance of storm surge flooding look like in the city? And you can kind of see that there's obviously a rationale for taking action between now and the end of the century. Next slide, please. Then you can kind of see how those transition. That's right. You can transition over time to less likely events and less likely events, and then again, what's the extent of the maximum storm surge flooding that can be anticipated, and then also just as importantly, the depth of that flooding was also a factor that was generated as part of this analysis. So basically, for everywhere in the city, we can identify what is anticipated to be impacted by tidal effect and what is anticipated to be impacted by storm surge effects from now to the end of the century. Next slide. So the other thing to understand is that there's also the precipitation effects. And so we utilized a stormwater model that was available for the city to determine those areas that potentially could have flooding. And this is kind of shows for conditions in 2040. And in order to generate the conditions for 2040, we had to change a few factors that were included in the model, one of which is we developed a future precipitation model for the area that looked at how precipitation may change into the future and increase slightly over existing conditions. And so this series of slides shows what a 25-year rainfall event would look like, and then what a 50-year rainfall event would look like, and then what a 100-year rainfall event would look like. And here you can kind of see the definition of the flood depths. If you look at the key on the lower left-hand side of your screen, you can see that, the effort was to kind of define not only areas of flooding, but the anticipated depth of flooding, because that depth could then be utilized to understand how the assets of the city might be impacted by combining it with information that was fed back to us by the city staff on what the effect of flooding would be at that individual asset. So Ashley's going to kind of talk through how this data and information is going to be utilized to develop the recommendations in the plan. Ashley.
Thank you, Mike. So when we were defining risk, we looked at two main metrics to define our risk. The first is the likelihood of a flooding impact. It goes from low to enhanced. This is how likely an asset is going to flood, whether it's going to be something like a tropical storm that floods it, up to something that like it would take a Category 5 storm to flood. So if it's going to take a really strong storm to flood, that is a low risk. If something smaller, like a summer rain or a tropical storm, is going to flood it, that becomes an enhanced risk or enhanced likelihood. Next, we looked at our asset categorization. For every asset that we identified, we determined whether it would have a minor impact, which means that no services would be impacted from any sort of event. A major impact would be some services, or potentially most of the services would be impacted by an event. And then a significant categorization is that not only would the services be impacted, but safety and community operations would be impacted. So literally, we could not function as well as a city if this asset was impacted. So we're looking at this matrix here, things that are in the upper left-hand corner. So they have a minor impact and a low likelihood. Those are things that we might look at into the future, but right now they're not our high priorities because there's a very low risk of something happened to it. If assets fell into the bottom right-hand corner where it's a significant asset and there's a very strong enhanced likelihood of an event affecting it, then those are our highest priorities and the things that we are putting at the top of our list. An example of one of those is our wastewater plant and some of our coastal parks, because they are fairly vulnerable to different types of weather events or climate events. When we were doing our risk analysis, the first thing we did was identify our impact elevation. So that is looking at an individual asset and at what level of flooding or water or temperature that asset would be impacted, or the operation of it would be impacted. Next, we looked at our flooding elevation and probabilities. So that's looking at would it take a 25-year storm, or would it take a Category 5 hurricane to affect this property? Like what level is really going to affect it? And then lastly, we categorize the risks to the assets based on that likelihood and timing. So this is looking at, sure, it might be at high risk, but not really until maybe 10 years down the road. Right now, it's at a fairly low risk, but in 10 years, it's going to be higher, or in 20 years. So right now, we might start pre-planning, but so that we will be resilient in the future. This map here is a good representation of our flooding risk by year. All the red dots are different above ground community assets. This isn't a representation of our underground, because we do have a lot of underground assets, a lot of pipes and things like that, but these are our physical buildings and parks and how they are going to be affected by flooding. We have it for a 25-year storm surge. And what that means, a 25-year storm surge is something like a tropical storm Eta that we just saw come through. And we did see with Eta in our water lines is that this was pretty spot on to where this light blue is. That's where we actually got flooding and where our lines went up to. Some of our facilities, people who haven't seen that, they were surprised at the water level. But then when we went back to our models and maps, we're like, but we knew this. Like, we know this going forward. So we do know that our models are pretty accurate in predicting what will happen. And you can see as we move towards the end of the century, our storm surge, even for just a tropical storm, something smaller, is reaching all the way north up into Tampa Road of flooding. So that's not even including if we're going higher level. All right, so we're going to start a poll in just a second. With this one, we want to understand or get your feedback on what you consider, what factors we should consider in our decision making. Right now, most of the things that we do to define risk are directly or how risk directly impact physical risk to assets. So it's like how a storm floods or how wind knocks something over, what is happening to the actual building. But we want to know what other factors we should be considering. This is a kind of multiple choice. You should be able to choose more than one answer. There's also a fill-in section. So feel free if there's something that we missed that we didn't think about to add in yourself. We're going to leave this open if you want to go ahead and open that up. And just let us know. We'll give you a minute or two to. All right, looks like pretty much everyone has responded. These will be left open through the presentation. So if you think of something else and want to amend your answers, feel free to do so. It looks like our highest priority is outage duration and impact, which is very important to people. How long are we going to be without a service or maybe a park? Next to highest we have is public safety and economic impact. Also very, very important things to look at. We want to make sure that our citizens are as safe as we can make them. And as we saw with COVID, the economics of events are very important. And then we have some answers for social equity and public health as well. We will be definitely taking those into consideration as we start continue finalizing our plan. All right, so now that we kind of know what our risks are, how do we change those into actions? We have three different types of strategies that we look at when we're figuring out our actions. The first is a political level strategy. These are different policies that we make to planning procedures to make ourselves more resilient. It's things like raising the base floor elevation that's required for building new properties, or requiring or not allowing people to build in certain areas to make sure that we don't have repeat flooding or disasters coming through when disasters come through. It's also looking at our own internal policies that we have for ourselves, how we as a city operate, how we look at our buildings and our infrastructure, and how we want to go forward into the future. The next one is area-wide strategies. These are things that we do to protect a city asset, but it also helps provide a wider community benefit. Something like this would be restoring our wetlands. While we might just be restoring wetlands on city-owned property, the benefits are to our citizens as well. Because the point of a wetland is to absorb that extra water so that private residences aren't flooded. So there are several things that we can do that will be a larger impact to the city. And then lastly, we have facility level strategies. These are things that we do to individual assets, like armoring, hardening them to make sure that floodwaters can't get in, or that wind, making them stronger wind ratings. So it's very localized and really only impacts the individual asset. The next couple of slides, we're just going to go through a few of these in your handouts and in the presentation that's in your handouts. You actually have more information than what we're presenting in the slides for you to look at your leisure. But these are kind of a few of the strategies that we've already thought about. It's not an extensive list of everything, but just I give you an idea of the things that we're looking at. When we're going through, when we define short term, that's in 1 to 5 years. It's something that we can do now and don't have to wait on. Midterm things are 5 to 10 years. They take a little bit of planning and maybe a little bit of finding funding for, but they're reasonably cost effective, and they don't take massive amounts of time. And then our long term is 10 plus years. These are things that are usually high costs and very technical. So they're going to require a lot of planning, a lot of design, and a lot of capital to get the projects going. So WRF is our wastewater reclamation facility. It is where all of the wastewater, so anything that goes down your toilets or indoor drains, goes, and also it creates our reclaimed water that used for outdoor irrigation. So one of the things that we have for our short term is reducing the inflow and infiltration. So what that basically means is that if we line our pipes or close off some of the holes to our manholes, that where storm water is getting in, that can help our wastewater plant by making sure we're not processing water from storm water. We're only processing our wastewater, and that will help our volume. So we're not just using extra chemicals, extra run times, and just extra to clean water that is just rain. One of our midterms is to elevate our electrical. This is something that at WRF, most things, as it is a wastewater treatment plant, they are meant to be underwater. But as we all hopefully know, electricity and water don't mix well. So even though most of our plant can run underwater, when the electrical panels become inundated with water, it then makes it inoperable. So right now we do have them raised, but as water levels are rising, we see that we are going to need to raise our electrical a little bit higher to make sure we don't run the risk of them becoming underwater. And for the long term, our major thing for the long term, which in this case, long term for us means 30 to 50 years, not 10, is the possibility of relocating the facility altogether. It is close to the coast and in a flood-prone area, but wastewater facilities are very expensive and very hard to move. So this will take a lot of planning, and most take at least 20 to 30 years from an idea of we're going to have one to actually having a new facility. So this is something we would be looking for towards closer towards the end of the century than now. We move on to our parks and natural areas. There are quite a few short-term things, which is really great that we can do in our parks. You don't know, the city of Oldsmar, about 40% of our land is park or preserve, which is really great because our parks work. One, people love the natural and the outdoor aspects of our parks, so lots of recreation. But one of the things that are really great about them is that they act as natural buffers for our citizens and our private property. Mobley Bayou absorbs a lot of water that would otherwise go into private property and flood your homes. So having our parks in really good conditions helps everyone with their flooding risk. So some of the short-term things that we can do in our coastal parks is creating resilient shorelines. So with this, there's a couple different things. Using oysters. Oysters are really great at reducing wave action and slowing it down. They also help clean the water. We are in an area that just doesn't have good water circulation, just as a natural product of where we are located on the bay. So the oysters would help with the runoff and things like that to help keep our area of the bay cleaner. Additionally, planting more mangroves. Mangroves act the same way. They reduce the wave. If you're ever out at Ariolds or one of our parks and you're watching the waves come in, I encourage you to look where there are no mangroves and then look at the mangroves and see how the difference of even the small waves, how they hit the shore with a mangrove. And then if we go into our long term, we're looking at creating living seawalls or living walls. And this is not creating a giant wall around our city. We know that's not something that people would love, but with a natural wall, that's using nature, whether it is trees or using slopes, things like that, to stabilize our eroding areas. So it's using natural ways instead of using hardened like concrete to do the same thing. So when we're going through our planning selection criteria, like I said before, first we identified our high risk assets, and then next we identified a suite of possible adaptation strategies. We're going into the assessing the possible strategies against proposed criteria, and this is where we want some of your feedback as well. We have a list here of some possible different criteria in 3 different categories. Technical is can it happen? Is it, whether it is feasible technically, the cost, is the timeline something that we are able to deal with? Is it too short, too long, things like that? Political and social are, we could present something, will the public accept it? If we went out and said, hey, let's build a 20-foot wall around the entire city, would people accept it? I don't think they would, and I don't think council would. So that's some of the things we're looking at with political and social. Will it be adopted and supported by the regulatory and public citizens? And last is our consequences. So there's positive and negative. Consequences typically have a negative connotation to it, but they can be positive. So our co-benefits, these are things that, say you increase our wetlands, it does the job that you have it do, but it also improves the water quality and it creates habitat for different fish species. And it does, it creates recreational facilities for our citizens. So even though you design it for one purpose, it has other benefits that some you might think of, but others that just enhance why you do it. And then cascading impacts can be both positive and negative. Positive is you do something and it just keeps getting better with time. You plant one tree and then it propagates itself, so it stabilizes and just enhances. The other flip side of that is a cascading impact of being, say we decide to build a seawall around one neighborhood, but a cascading effect impact could be now the 2 neighborhoods on either side are flooding that didn't flood before. So you solved the one problem, but you created 2 more. So looking at those different things. And after we decide what criteria we want to use for our strategies, we're then going to identify what the specific strategies we want to put into the plan and propose to the citizens and to our council. So we're going to do another poll. In this one, we do want you to look at what types of actions, when we're looking at our actions, what should we prioritize in the planning process? The same with this one, there are multiple choice, and you can also write in an answer if there's something that we did not think about, because sometimes we don't realize what everyone else wants. So we would love your feedback on this. Okay, it looks like we have most of the responses back. We have a lot of good responses here. It looks like our two highest are technical feasibility and potential cascading impacts. Very important. If you cannot do it, then there's no point in pursuing it. But we do want to consider something that might not be technically feasible right now, could be feasible in the next 10 years or so. As we all see, technology moves pretty quickly. So having an idea and then trying to figure out how we can do it later is a potential to put on a list for down the road. Next, we have implementation timeline and cost as our next two highest. Cost is very important. If we don't have the funding, then definitely finding a way to do that. And then it looks like everything else is tied for applicability, political and regulatory, public acceptance, co-benefits. So we will definitely take all of those into consideration as we start putting our actions into the plan. The next couple of slides are just giving you a little bit of a visual representation of the chart that we looked at earlier of different types of strategies that have been recommended. This one is for our WRF and our short term of increasing the elevation of a wet well. You can see in that picture on the bottom left of your screen, that is a wet well. And what that does is when water, you can see it is at ground level. And when it floods, if your well is at the top of your well is at the same level as the ground, that means that you have nowhere else for water to go. So just by raising the top of our well means that we won't have additional stormwater going into it and filling it up when we have a flooding event. Next in our midterm is increasing the electrical elevation, which we talked about a little bit before. You can kind of see in this middle picture that the electrical is on poles. This picture actually shows a fairly normal rain event. It was, I think, a bit of a rainy summer. We had quite a bit of rain, but this was not a heavy storm. It wasn't a tropical storm or something like this. This was a rain event. And you can see for this right now, the electrical is high enough and it's not underwater. But when we start adding 4 feet of sea level rise to this, or it is a tropical storm event, the electrical will start being a little bit too low. So just increasing that up so that we make sure our plant is operational. And then in the long term, relocating our plant. You can kind of see from this picture at the top right that there's a lot of moving parts in a wastewater plant. It is not easy to move, and there are a lot of regulations and planning that goes into it. For anything on this level, we not only report at a city level, we report at a county, state, and federal level. So it's not something that we can do in a year or two or even 10 or 20 years. Most plants, from the time that it is initial thought to a fully functional plant, is somewhere between 20 and 30 years. So this is something that's on our radar right now of in the next 30 to 50 years, we would want to move our plant. So we know we need to start planning if we want to move it in 30 years, we need to start planning within the next 10 years. For our coastal parks, some strategies that we have for our short term, we talked earlier about our oyster reefs down in the bottom right-hand corner, or left-hand corner, excuse me, are oyster balls. So what these do is you put them out in the water and then oysters recruit onto them and create a reef. And this helps with reducing our wave action. It also helps clean our water and making sure that we have the best recreational area that we can. For our midterm, some of the things are raising parking lots and like our piers and our some of the other critical infrastructure like electrical infrastructure, things like that, just raising them up a bit to making sure that they're not underwater when we have flooding. And then in our long term is actually elevating facilities or relocating them. And depending, it's nearly impossible to relocate a park, but what we could do is to move a bathroom somewhere to higher ground so it's not flooded, or even like at Ariolds where we have the amphitheater, maybe we can't completely raise the amphitheater, but what we can do is kind of change around the other parts of the park so that water is diverted purposefully to other places to flood so that the facilities themselves do not flood. All right, so in addition to looking at our resiliency plan and how we want to move forward, we're also with this looking at our community rating system. The community rating system is a federal program through the National Flood Insurance Program. And what it does is that it takes the things that we do as a city and the things that we do to reduce flood risk, and it turns it around to reduce our citizens' flood insurance rates. Right now, we are at a CRS Class 6, which saves people within the special flood hazard area 20%. And with the new FEMA flood maps that are going to be that are adopted in the next month or two, pretty much most anything south of Tampa Road will be in the special flood hazard area. So saving 20% on there, and anything outside of the special flood hazard area would be saving 10%. Some of the things that we do with this CRS and what we are already doing and we're adding on and with these different adaptation strategies is looking at outreach projects. So not only the things that we physically do to our properties, but how we educate our citizens on what you can do to help your own personal property, like actions you could take to help make your property more resilient. As we said earlier, we do have a lot of parks and preserves. 40% of our land is a park or preserve, so open space, we do really well in this category. We are actually 4 times the national average for parks and preserves and open space in Oldsmar, so that helps not only have recreation areas, but our parks act as buffers for our private properties as well. So they absorb a lot of the water that would normally flood houses and private properties. We're also looking at different regulatory standards. That's things like what is the base floor elevation, where can you build, where can you not build, and things like that. Even stuff to how what types of pipes you can use to make sure that they're not going to be destroyed or break down too quickly. We've created a stormwater management plan with the Southwest Florida Water Management District a couple years ago. So we are updating that and making sure that is the best possible plan that we can have. Floodplain management and floodplain protection. Like I said, we are looking more at that, looking at the ways that we can divert water or make it a more directed area for things to go. So as we implement our CRP, right now we are finalizing the plan with feedback that we get from you guys and from strategies and ideas that our consultant are developing. So once we establish our plan, we don't want this to be a document that sits on a shelf and gets all dusty. We want this to be an actionable plan, something that moves forward and the actions that we propose actually happen. So once we have the plan, the real work starts. Now we will start identifying different funding sources for our adaptation strategies. We are going to start incorporating these things into our capital plan and into our master plan, making sure that we conduct environmental surveys and work with our regulatory agencies to have the best kind of resilient foot forward. So a couple of key things coming up. We are definitely welcoming and we encourage public input. We have until April 7th to voice your comments, opinions, questions, all of that. The best way to do that is to email me at apainter@myoldsmar.com. I will definitely respond to everything, and we will try to take into account everything that people have said into our plan. We would definitely want to make sure that we are doing this for the whole community and putting the best foot that we can forward. Now we'll go into our Q&A. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A section. We do have one that is, what is the city of Oldsmar prepared or planning to do to assist residents in protecting our property? So one of the things that we are looking at is some of the things that we are doing to our own property helps protect your property. We are also looking at and preparing some educational and workshops on personal property protection. So things that you can do individually to protect your property. Also, working, I know the different agencies, we will help try to identify different agencies that have funding available for individuals to help shore up and make their own properties more resilient. All right. Don't see any other questions. If anyone has anything else, or if Mike, you have anything else you want to add in, feel free.
Nope, I do not. I mean, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that all of this, the intent of developing all this data is it can be used for multiple purposes moving ahead. Like you pointed out, Ashley, there's the identification of the original concerns, and then that can pivot forward to utilizing it maybe for planning and design of certain implementation strategies, and it could also be used for identifying areas, even community areas that could be benefited in the future. So one of the better outcomes of the plan is going to be so much information that could be used for 4 or 5 years beyond in other planning and capital programming projects. So I think that's one of the better outcomes of the plan that should be seen as a resource for everyone in the city.
Yes, and also kind of on that note, the question is that even though we do some of the things that are in the plan that we're putting it specifically for our city asset, but it can translate to private property as well. you can go both ways. So it might just be downscaled to a private, obviously you're not going to do quite as much for a home as we would for City Hall, but if you're in the same area, you can kind of look and see what types of things that we would do to shore up that building and do a little bit for yourself. All right. Is there a way the city can work with privately owned drainage systems like forest lakes to make sure they are maintained adequately for expected weather events? So it depends on the drainage system. We do maintain quite a few, and we are updating some of the drainage systems. And I believe Forest Lakes is one of, they're in the process of doing some updates to the drainage in Forest Lakes now. But we highly encourage our HOAs or our neighborhoods to maintain. We can definitely start looking at least an education and maybe a recommendation type, list of things that you could do to help maintain your systems. If it is on private property, unfortunately, we can't do it ourselves, but we can definitely have a best practices that we can put out for that. All right. So I don't see any other questions. Like I said, you guys have until April 7th to give any other questions, comments, if you have any other feedback. Definitely go through the handouts. And if you have other questions once you go through it, feel free to reach out to me. Let's see, we got a couple more that just came in. Could inadequate maintenance of the Forest Lake system adversely impact the city's infrastructure? It could. It depends on what it is and which system it is. Most likely, the impact's going to be more towards your properties than to the infrastructure, because it would cause an inadequate maintenance, usually of a stormwater system or a drainage system, typically causes backup and flooding more so than anything else. But there could be some impacts to other stuff as well. Does the city already own land that is suitable for a new WRF location? We haven't really scoped that out because it's something that is in the future. There's a possibility, most likely if we do a new facility, it would be north of Tampa Road somewhere. A lot of this would depend on some of the environmental and federal, like we would have to discuss it with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and with the Southwest Florida Water Management District, because building in certain areas, it's a lot of environmental impact. So we could potentially already own it, but it would have to be rezoned for such a thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think also, the identification of that facility being at risk is like step one of that process. You want to kind of walk through the process of determining the point at which the risk get to be so high that the city takes action, and also the opportunity for and cost effectiveness of the various strategies that Ashley outlined earlier. How long could elevations, of infrastructure strategy be viable? How long could you put a facility protection strategy in place that might give you a kind of a longer period for planning? I think the identification of that is kind of as an issue is, as Ashley was saying, the kind of the planning and planning process for that is, any major infrastructure project is potentially decades in length. And so obviously starting to think about that in the nearer term makes sense from that perspective, but I don't think any actions relative to even considering the move are set at this point. It's just been identified as a possible risk.
Yeah, and this is, like I said, this is just a possibility. It's not something that we are definitely an action that we will be taking. We are actually in the process of raising our control building at the wastewater facility now. So we are taking actions that are less extreme than moving the facility and that make more sense right now. So our control building in the next couple of years will be raised with, we're in the preliminary design phases right now of that. So there are a lot of things that we can do before we get to relocation of the entire facility. That's kind of a last resort kind of thing. And like I said, it would probably be at least another 50 years down the road before we would even consider, well, not, but it would even be an option to move it. All right. A lot of great questions. Any other questions before we finish tonight? I highly recommend, like I said, we would love public input from everyone. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or comments. Also, if you have any neighbors that would be interested, feel free to share the handouts with them. And have them contact me if they have any additional input that they would like to give. You can visit our website, resilientoldsmar.com, which will have additional information we will be adding as new stuff comes in, we will be adding to the site. So check back periodically and we will have it out. The goal is to have this plan completed in May. To go out to the community and to our council. So we would love to hear more from you guys. And if there are no other questions, then I think we will.
Do you want to, Ashley, do you want to just talk about the meetings coming up on Saturday as well? Just to make everybody aware. Yeah.
That's true. If you do know someone who wasn't able to make it to the virtual meetings, we do have an in-person meeting happening on Saturday from 10 to 12 at State Street Center. So there is a sign up on our website, or you can and via Facebook as well. All right. Well, thank you all for coming tonight and spending a little bit of your evening with us to learn more about the plan and help us have a little bit more input. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions, and have a great evening.